just a brief story about how I got involved in all of this wolf mess. I stepped into a graduate position in 2002 at Utah State University, thinking I was going to become a wildlife ecologist. That was the summer of 2002. We moved out to Logan, and that fall, a wolf from Yellowstone National Park walked 200 miles as the crow flies and stepped in a coyote trap that was set in Morgan, Utah. And I watched it sort of, to use Rob's language, it went poof, right? So it exploded socially, and I'd never seen anything like it, and I thought, oh my God, wolves are really interesting, but people are way more interesting than wolves. They are, because wolves do things that are relatively predictable. As much variation as there is and as much noise as there is in those data sets, they do things that are relatively predictable, whereas people do things that I just often see as crazy. And so I was very interested in seeing if I could explain that. And of course, getting to marry the love that I had of ecology and wildlife with the craziness that was going on that I was seeing in the social world was a great way to get to marry two loves of mine, I guess. Are we okay on presentation? Can I go ahead and start? We got a thumbs up. Okay, good. So, oh yeah, so there it is. So, when we talk about conflict related to wolves or carnivores in general, we have a tendency to frame the problem in terms of human-wildlife conflict, right? So this is really the dominant frame. Wolves are killing livestock. Wolves are killing things that we like, our pets, our ungulates that we like to hunt, right? And so it's constantly this frame that we adopt of wolves killing things that we like. And so the question that jumps out from this is, how do we live with animals that can potentially kill us and that are killing things that we like, and we don't like them to kill those things? And so that's been sort of the dominant frame that we've used to approach human-wildlife conflict with carnivores. And I want to, I'll do this, I hope subtly, but I want to kind of challenge that frame. We have a conspicuous history with wolves, and this is one that I don't think I need to belabor too much because I think the audience is very familiar with it, but we start off by really killing the things that wolves eat, and then we replace them with other things that they could eat. And then when we discover that wolves do eat those things, we move on to killing wolves. And so that's kind of conspicuous in and of itself. But then our response later on, of course, was to say, hey, why did we do that and put wolves back where we had just killed them from, which is kind of odd as well, right? We've moved on from that, as numerous presenters have talked about, and now we're into this stage where we do things, we involve wolves as sort of a part of our recreational activity. So we hunt wolves, we trap wolves, and we stand in national parks on hills in freezing temperatures observing them. And if anybody, let's see if I can do this. That's Doug right there. Just a couple weeks ago in Yellowstone, I was out there for a research meeting, and we had maybe 75, 80 people, maybe 100 actually, on the hillside staring at wolves from 2 miles distance. So kind of crazy. The success of wolves, that I don't need to belabor at all because it's been talked about in great detail. The success of wolves in the Northern Rockies is part of what you might call a larger carnivore comeback. And so large carnivores making a comeback, a resurgence in parts of Europe, grizzly bear populations in Yellowstone National Park and beyond the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And more recently, there's been a lot of talk about cougars. In fact, in my state of Ohio, I work at Ohio State University, we had our first confirmed cougar sighting last year when a state wildlife officer had a cougar sighting in really the last part of Ohio that you would ever predict that a cougar would show up. So moving on to kind of the talk about this, having these carnivores in more places, especially in places where people dominate, right, brings up this question, this management problem. How do we coexist with animals that can kill us? And a whole variety of interesting researchable questions result from that, right? And so the one that I'll sort of focus on here is what makes us tolerant or intolerant of large carnivores. And that'll be the theme of my talk. And really, I should have said this in the very beginning, But this involves a number of graduate students, research really that I started back at Utah State back in 2002, 2003, but has continued in a variety of forms. And so, so special thanks go to the whole lab, all the graduate students and that have been involved in these papers over the past 7 years. So one way to approach this problem of tolerance is to think about and to ask this question, you know, where can we coexist with wolves, is to look spatially at where we are relative to where wolf populations are. And so here the little black counties, those are counties with greater than 142 people per square kilometer. And that number was derived actually by looking at European data, mostly European data where they have really good data on wolf populations relative to human sizes, and trying to come up with a threshold for where a wolf can exist alongside of human populations. And we really see this as sort of a potential threshold of where you can't possibly have wolves even living in the periphery of these areas. But the take-home message from this, right, is that there's a whole broad swath of the lower 48 where wolves used to be, and they currently aren't. Okay, so the purple lines here, the striped lines actually indicate where wolves currently are. Another way to think about this question of tolerance is to use some really simple attitudinal data. The real first study that did this, the only study that I'm aware of that did this at the national level, was done by Stephen Kellert back in 1978. Actually, the data was collected. And he interviewed over 3,000 US residents and asked about a whole variety of species. They published 26 different species, their people's attitudes toward those species. And these were just sort of self-ratings of like or dislike toward those animals. And what he found was wolves kind of showed up in the middle toward the bottom, if you will. Okay, so here's the wolf and the coyote. The numbers don't really mean all that much except relative to sort of the others, right? And essentially what they found is people were sort of, overall, were kind of neutral to negative. So we finally had the ability to replicate Kellert's work. We did this in February of this year using a little bit of a different approach to adjust for some of the problems we have in more recently in data collection using surveys and especially interview approaches. But so we were able to replicate this. This is unpublished data, but we're working on a publication right now. And so what I want to draw your attention to here is this end of the spectrum are people that are very positive toward wolves. The red is 2014, the gray is 1978. This end is people that are negative toward wolves, and what we see is a tremendous increase overall nationally in people that are positive toward wolves, moving from 43 to 61%, and a decrease in those that are negative, moving from 39 to 17%. And this actually, speaking of contradictions, right, this conflicts with a lot of the other research literature that's been published, some of which I've been involved in. We've done studies that have shown in Utah, for example, that people were over roughly a 10-year time period, their attitude stayed roughly the same. Adrian, who's sitting here, has done some work that has showed a decline in public tolerance for wolves in Wisconsin, especially his area of research is really focused on where wolves are. And then there's some other research from Scandinavia that shows a similar decline in public attitudes. Just put this slide in. This is sort of an afterthought, but just letting folks know. So we actually did replicate all 26 of the animals that Kellert published in his 85 publication. And what you see, what I found this was really interesting, which is, I guess, why it's here. There was positive movement in what you might call 6 historically stigmatized species. And wolves among them, so bats, vultures, rats, sharks, wolf, coyote, all saw positive movement. And negative movement, and that makes sense, I guess. You could view that maybe through an ecological lens, people starting to see the ecological value in those animals. I'm not sure. We don't have data on that really indicates how to interpret that, so I'm just guessing at this point. But any guesses down here, I'd love to hear them. So come talk to me afterwards why there's a decrease in attitudes towards swans and raccoons. Okay, so if you haven't already figured it out, I'm really a psychologist by training, and really psychologists are interested in what goes on up here, and ultimately connecting that and those mental processes to actual behaviors. And this gets kind of interesting in the case of wolves. So I point this slide out because I want folks to understand that there is an immediate connection between what I'm trying to do and what the other folks that are in this room are trying to do. Okay, and so I'm trying to understand the processes that result in behaviors, and I'm trying to understand the behaviors and actually the policies that result in outcomes for wolves. And some of those outcomes can be negative, and they can precipitate the loss of a population or the stewardship or coexistence with wolf populations. Okay, but it's this intersection, right, between human behavior and human policy setting that results in these outcomes that is my primary interest. Okay, so we're going to step back. So I've already had raccoons and vultures and rats and stuff up there. So we're going to step back a little bit further and start with a study that we conducted back in 2009, 2010. And this study dealt with bears in Ohio. And so this is the one, I didn't disclose funders, and the reason I didn't do that is because I don't have any funders. It's really hard to get people to want to study attitudes toward wolves. Mostly the studies that do it, they occur with states, and the states have a particular agenda, and they don't necessarily want to talk to people that might tell them something that conflicts with their agenda. So that's my experience anyways. So it's really hard to get people to fund that. So we self-fund a lot of these things. This is a case, the Ohio Division of Wildlife, who I've had a close partnership with. I work in the Terrestrial Wildlife Ecology Lab there, and the Division of Wildlife is a sponsor and a partner. They asked us to do this research, and really simply they wanted to understand what affects people's acceptance toward black bear populations. We have, much like Washington and Oregon, we have a recovering black bear population, although the bears don't recover at the same rate wolves do. But we have about 150 black bears in the state, and the surrounding states have lots of them, so we know they're coming. And the state was being forward-thinking. They wanted to understand this. So like any good psychologist, I started with a mental model. So we turned to the research literature on hazards, on people trying to understand what makes people accepting of hazards. And most of the research literature is on things like genetically modified organisms. So this is a stretch for maybe carnivores. But this is really what you might call, it starts with really a very rational model, right? It says that everything else being equal, people are going to judge the acceptability of a hazard based upon the perceptions of risks they associate with that hazard and the perception of benefits. And then there are going to be some other variables that are going to influence those perceptions of risks and benefits, but those are going to be the primary predictors. When you do survey work, you don't get those really good pictures of data collection. So when I go into a room, I'm always jealous. All you guys have awesome pictures of your data collection, like a wolf with a mask on it and some poor graduate student that's laboring over the animal. And I don't get any of that. If I was to show that, it'd be like pictures of my grad students sitting in front of a computer with like torn up thumbs from going through envelopes and things. So. But we do get to hear, we get wonderful responses from respondents, and especially in the comment sections so I always, when I go through surveys, I'm always looking at the comment sections because I love to read those. So this slide really, to interpret this for you, these are, for social science anyway, these are relatively strong relationships. We're explaining roughly 60% of the variation in people's judgments regarding the acceptability of bear populations, and we could relate those directly to perceived risks and benefits. So we're really happy with the way that model performed. All of the hypotheses that are in the model that are represented here by arrows, all of those hypotheses came out the way we expected. So that was good. So the next thing, and probably more relevant to this audience, we wanted to understand tolerance for wolves. And in particular, we wanted to address this idea that you hear a lot, and I guarantee you that you have all heard it, and probably some of you have muttered it as well. And that is that, oh, damn, everyone's decisions about wolves, it's all about emotion, right? It's all about, everyone's reacting emotionally. So, and usually it's one side accusing the other side of being emotional, but it happens both ways, right? So we wanted to, we took a little bit of a departure from the hazard model approach. We took the main predictors, but we wanted to really focus in on effective reactions, and we needed a sample of people that we knew that were going to be really involved. So we wanted to pick people that really cared about the issue of wolves. And so we structured our sample by using an online a news source, the Wildlife News, where there's a lot of news stories about wolves, and there's a lot of debate that goes on there. And so our sampling approach was to try to get respondents from that blog. And we ended up with roughly 800 people in a week's worth of time, which was shocking. Now, I will tell you something happened that was kind of fortuitous along the way, and that was that the Wildlife News, which has a very, I would say, a relatively pro-wolf stance, the link that we provided on that site was picked up, and we could actually track this because of the IP addresses. The link was actually picked up by a hunting blog in Washington State. And so it really bifurcated our sample, and it led to some interesting results. So in this case, we wanted to move beyond just judgments about wolves or attitudes toward wolves, and we wanted to look at intentions to engage in behaviors that were either supportive of wolf populations or in opposition. And if folks want to know how we measured that, you can come talk to me afterwards, but we used a whole variety of behaviors, and these are sort of aggregate measures, if you will. And so we applied our hazard model approach, but with one little quick adjustment, and that is we measured people's emotional reaction to wolves. And so what did we find? We found an interesting effect. So here in this population of people that cared a lot about the issue, cared enough to answer a very lengthy questionnaire that was published on this website, we found a much stronger effect of benefits than risk perceptions, right? It was really the disagreement and the ability to explain variance was revolved around those perceptions of benefits that we associate with wolves. And these are mostly sort of ecological benefits, trophic cascade sorts of things, if you will, increases in tourism, those sorts of things. But we found both a small direct effect but a very large indirect effect of one's effective reaction. So as one became more positive toward wolves, they perceived higher benefits, as you might predict. And as you perceived higher benefits, you were much more likely to engage in supportive actions. Conversely, we also measured intentions to engage in what you might call intolerant actions. And what was striking here is we see the exact same pattern with maybe one minor modification, and that is now we see a much stronger direct effect. So as people had a negative affective reaction or emotional reaction toward wolves, there was a direct effect on their intention to engage in intolerant actions directed at wolf populations. Dave Meach raised this question a few years ago in an article in Biological Conservation, and this relates directly to that last item that I just showed you, or that last slide that I just showed you. So we're suggesting that in the literature, and the people that really care about wolf populations, that benefits are more important in their decisions or their actions than the perceptions of risk. So who perceive benefits? Well, Dave suggested that science may be sanctifying the wolf by publishing more and more studies about the benefits of them, and that the media, importantly, was complicit in this by picking up stories and publishing stories about wolves that were beneficial, and avoiding the sort of risk literature. And so we were surprised that Dave's study was published after ours. He apparently hadn't seen it, so this study was published in 2010. And we actually, as opposed to his work, which he looked at 10 sources that were largely sort of biased toward groups that were very positive toward wolves, we looked at all of the available news media coverage, electronically available news media coverage over a 10-year time period. Okay, so this was 6,000 stories, and we coded 30,000 paragraphs using some digital software, and got to about a 90% success rate in terms of our coding scheme. And so what we found, interestingly, is exactly the opposite. So the news media trends trended toward more negative news coverage about wolves, and really associated with depredation events. If you started to look in there, there's some papers in the northern Rocky Mountains that anytime a wolf kills a sheep, there are 3 newspapers that pick up the story, and there's a story about it. So quite the opposite of sanctifying wolves, the news media was headed in the other direction. And just drawing your attention to this, the coverage, if you looked at it over time, the effect is actually more profound. So I probably should have put a different slide in there. But the coverage with the area with the most negative news media coverage was with states with new wolf populations, okay? So here's where and this is actually consistent with the literature, the applied literature on judgment, decision-making, and risk, which says that that our perceptions of risks are really determined by the novelty of that risk, or they're inflated by the novelty or newness of a risk, and by what's called dread associated with that, or how terrifying that risk is. And so wolves can be terrifying because they kill things, and so for some people they are terrifying critters. And of course they were new in these areas, and so one would predict, in fact we did predict, that we would see higher negative news media coverage in those areas. So back to the problem definition, what have we kind of learned here? I said in the very beginning that human-wildlife conflict is often cast in terms of the effects of wolves, or the interactions between wolves and things that we like, wolves and people, okay? And even the model that I just showed you that focused on perceived benefits and risks associated with wolves, or perceived risks and benefits associated with the bears, this suggests a very rational approach to dealing with animals, right? If we see them as being really risky, then we're probably not going to accept having them around. If we see them as being very beneficial, then we probably will. That suggests that we're very rational in our approach. Although the fact that our rationality seems to be determined in part by our emotions is kind of scary, right? So one way of framing this is, and this is the dominant frame, is as interest-based conflict. It's really people just looking out for their interest, right? So if I'm a rancher, I know that wolves kill livestock. I'm looking out for my interests. I want to keep wolf populations low, so I keep wolf depredations low. That all makes sense. If I'm this guy and I'm interested in hunting elk, I don't like wolves killing elk because that potentially impacts my ability to successfully harvest an elk. If I want to go to Yellowstone and stand on the hill and view wildlife, then I want wildlife to be around. I'm not stereotyping. This is Ashley Judge, so she's been an advocate for wolves, so that's why her picture's there. I needed an advocate picture. Okay, so we can contrast the interest-based approach with what you might call an identity-based approach. And this is based on social identity theory, and I won't get too much into the specifics of social identity theory. The way I explain it to undergraduates is this, because they don't believe this idea that, you know, we could get really emotional about issues that aren't really all that meaningful. And so I said, oh yeah, really? So were any of you watching the game this weekend? And how did you feel about the loss to Michigan? Or I'm from Ohio State, so I have to derogate that school to the north, as we call them. So, so sports are probably the best explanation of identity-based conflict that one can come up with. In fact, we know we have many examples every year. People are killed at sporting events, right? In fights with people from the opposing side. So despite the fact that I have no interest whatsoever, and no true interest beyond sort of my emotional involvement in that sporting event, people do crazy things, right? So we're moving back to that theme of why I got involved in this to begin with. People do crazy things when their identity is implicated, okay? So what does this mean in the context of wolf management and all the controversy that wolves generate? So we stepped back from that previous approach and we said, what if we looked at identity? And we actually had some measures, and we asked people, actually, the reason we did this was totally unrelated to social identity theory at all. So we were really interested in, we found it really hard to measure hunters, and I've had this conversation with Adrian on a number of occasions. So we found it was really hard to classify someone as a hunter because, if you're like me, I hunted growing up as a kid, but I haven't hunted in 15, 20 years. So there are people that have hunted in the past. There are people that hunt every third or fourth or fifth year. And so any measure that we could come up with was having trouble of identifying them. And we said, why don't we just ask them how much they identify as a member of each of these groups? Well, we went well beyond asking about hunters. We asked about all the interest groups that we could think of that might possibly be relevant. And so this is that blog combination data set that I showed earlier. And what you see here is really striking when we're talking about beliefs about positive impacts. These are regression coefficients, by the way. They aren't R values. Those R values are actually higher. So what you see is people that define as animal rights advocates, environmentalists, conservationists, or wildlife advocates believe that wolves are going to be more beneficial. Conversely, people who identify as hunters, gun rights advocates, ranchers, or farmers, and property rights advocates are more likely to view wolves as not having those same positive benefits. And so we said, maybe this is a result of our sampling. You know, maybe this is just, you know, we've got these loony birds that answered our long survey that identified that, you know, it wasn't a random sample at all. So we asked this again, same slide, same data analysis, exactly the same measures, but in a national sample of US residents. This focuses in on residents of the Northern Rocky Mountains, so we had about 400 residents of the Northern Rocky Mountains. And what we see again is similar effects. They're not quite as strong as before, but we see similar impacts of identification with those interest groups and what they believe is true about wolves. And the important point here is there is one set of facts, right? There's one set of facts. There's one set of things that's true about whether or not wolves are beneficial and how they're beneficial on the landscape. But our identity with these different groups makes us judge those sets of facts very differently or perceive them very differently. Okay, let's go. So I'm kind of getting to the take-home message here. I've got a few minutes left. So clearly members of these different groups, they disagree about the impacts associated with wolves, whether or not they're beneficial, whether or not they're costly. I could have shown you the exact same relationships existed for risk judgments. I just focused on the benefits. And those are rooted in their identities, that is their group membership, how much they identify with each of these groups. One of the predictions of social identity theory is this. It says that it says there's a function to group identity, right? So in those of you that study maybe wolf packs and pack structure might understand that function, right? So it's good to be part of the group. As Doug's data showed, it's good to be part of a bigger group, right? If you're a wolf, it's really good to be part of a bigger group, especially if you have neighboring packs that are of a like size. So, we, as human beings, we want to maintain a positive self-image, positive personal identity, right? And so we affiliate with groups that make us feel positive about ourselves. But by implication, we tend to contrast those groups with the views of other groups. And so we necessarily, in order to feel good about ourselves, it's a relative thing, right? Somebody's got to be lower on the totem pole. And so what the research literature says is we tend to feel we tend to have self-enhancing images or self-enhancing beliefs about our own group and derogating images about the outgroup, right? So those folks are the outcasts. So we wanted to see maybe we could actually show that is happening with wolves. So, but first, just kind of a brief pause. So really focus, this is just an indication. So this is the extent to which someone identifies as a hunter. And this is one of those benefits, one of our benefit measures. Wolves keep deer, elk, and moose populations in balance, and this is their level of agreement. And what you see is just an example in one item of that decline in benefits. Okay, so that's there as an example. Over here is the percent indicating that they would shoot a wolf if they saw one. And this is the extent to which the respondent, again, identified as a hunter, slightly, moderately, strongly, or very strongly. And you can see the impact here of having a very strong identification with a particular group. And that's really problematic, okay? I want to suggest that's really problematic. What about the derogating outgroups? So I realize that this question may be offensive to some of you. It's meant to be provocative. So the response item was, wolves are not so bad. It's the people that support them that I cannot stand. And these are the correlations between people's agreement with that item and their identification into one of these groups. And so positive suggests that they believe that item or there's more agreement. Negative suggests that there's more disagreement. Finally, we know from the literature on communications that elite cues matter. Where do people pick up their attitudes and beliefs? In part, they get them from elite cues. They're looking out for people that are respected in the community, that they should look up to. They look to those elite cues for how they should behave, for how they should feel, for what they should believe. And so the elite cues around wolves are not very positive, okay? This is just one example. I could have put dozens of examples up here from various legislators, the governor of Idaho, various folks in Utah that are involved in state, unfortunately in state game agencies. This is just one example. But I want to point out that identities are contested, and you actually have people, elites in these communities that are saying things, hey, you know what, this is not an example of hunting. When you raise a weapon, when you raise your gun as an emotional expression of hatred toward a species, it is not hunting. I would tweak this statement in one small way. And here's what I think I'm going to actually say something maybe even more provocative than Rob did. So I would say that this is not necessarily an expression of hatred or dislike of wolves. Even this killing of wolves, I would say that wolf killing is largely symbolic to some of these communities, and it's really more of an expression of hatred or dislike toward the outgroup, okay? And that's the problematic piece of this. As a conservationist, I see that I'm running out of time here. So as a conservationist, I'm interested in the conservation of wildlife communities, wildlife populations, and what I see is hunters and ranchers, even to some extent, and wildlife advocates, and yes, even animal rights advocates to some extent, as allies in wildlife conservation overall. And so what I see is an issue that's divisive, that's dividing that community, and that doesn't serve any of our purposes very well. And so what we need is a way of negotiating that social conflict, right? Negotiating the social conflict is the problem. So I don't have if there was an easy solution to this, somebody would have come up with it well before me. I'm not that smart. So I don't have your easy solution, but I can turn back to the theory that's informed this talk and say, what have they said, what from a theoretical perspective could help us negotiate this identity-based conflict. One is a focus on shared goals rather than specific interests or outcomes. Things that, development of win-win scenarios are things that we know that we agree upon. So there's some recent research out of Michigan by Meredith Gore and her grad student Michelle Lute that suggested that there was large agreement across stakeholder groups about the long-term viability of wolf populations and about conserving wolves for future generations. It's one point of agreement. There were others in that paper. You build trust through cooperative efforts. Demonizing outgroups is not a cooperative effort. That's what we want to avoid, okay? So putting people in a room together and interacting cordially, and those social conventions that take over and say, I need to have a conversation even though we might disagree upon things. We need to have a conversation that's civil. Those sorts of interactions are really positive over the long term, and they can lead to more positive things long term. Be wary of power structures. So the power structure associated with the Endangered Species Act was really good for environmentalists when wolves were listed. But the power structures associated with state agencies and state management of wolves in the western U.S. right now aren't so good for the same people. So the power inequities just make the problem worse. So you have to be aware of those existing power structures and be willing to actually even cede some power in certain circumstances. And it may require a focus on improvements as opposed to solutions. Well, what does that mean? Improvements mean things that are a little bit better for every party, but they don't give us exactly what we want. If we kill too many of the wolves, if we kill lots and lots of wolves, that might be good for ranchers in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to lead to a solution that none of us are very happy with, relisting of wolves, okay? So focus on improvements. And really, that's all of the solutions that I can bring you from social identity theory, and I know that it's not, it's not a panacea. I can't tell you, I can't give you the key to circumventing the wolf controversy, but hopefully this at least has provoked a few thoughts. That's all I've had.